Do you believe in setting boundaries, even if it means losing people?
I asked my dad calmly, not with any kind of drama in my voice, why I wasn't in the new family photo album. The one my mom always prints every couple of years and mails out to all their friends and church people like some kind of proof that everything in the Hartsfield household is perfectly held together with white smiles and pressed colors. The album had my sister Amanda in matching dresses with her three daughters, all of them smiling like a Pinterest ad. It had my little brother Evan standing in front of the new church wing he helped fund with his faith and real estate business, whatever that means, and there was a double-page spread of my parents holding their new golden retriever, Max, wearing a tiny American flag bandana. There were 4th of July cookouts, Thanksgiving dinners, even baby showers for second cousins I've never met. I flipped through all 30-something glossy pages, waiting to see myself, maybe one picture from when I visited for Grandma's funeral last year, or even that Christmas Eve I'd flown in last minute and we'd taken a rushed group shot in front of the fireplace. But I wasn't there. Not once. Not even in the background. And when I asked, I didn't raise my voice, didn't accuse anyone of anything, just asked. My dad barely looked up from the kitchen table where he was doing a crossword and said, "You just don't fit the image." He didn't blink. Didn't stutter. Said it like he was commenting on the weather. "You don't fit the image." Like I was some red wine stain on their white carpet. Something they could scrub out and pretend had never been there. It was one of those moments where the air gets so thick around you that you forget how to breathe properly. I stared at him for a few seconds, trying to find something in his face, guilt, maybe, or even the trace of a joke, something that would let me laugh it off and pretend I hadn't heard what I just heard. But he didn't look up again. Just circled another word on the puzzle and took a sip of his tea. My mom, standing at the sink behind him, didn't say anything either. She just kept scrubbing a perfectly clean plate like her life depended on it. Amanda glanced over from the other side of the room, but immediately dropped her eyes back to her phone. Evan wasn't even there, said he had a men's group thing that night. Classic. That's when I realized something that should have hit me years ago but never fully settled in until right then. They weren't forgetting to include me. It wasn't an oversight. It was intentional. I was being erased. Deliberately. With focus. Like a decision they'd come to a long time ago and were now simply following through on with quiet, clean precision. I think I managed a small nod, not because I agreed, but because my body didn't know what else to do. I placed the album back on the table, careful not to let it slam or shake, and excused myself to the guest room without saying another word. The house was quiet, save for the hum of the dishwasher and the low sound of a TV playing a Hallmark movie in the background. I sat on the edge of the bed, still fully dressed, and stared at the walls that were covered in floral wallpaper my mom had put up in the early 90s. Nothing had changed in that room since high school. Same pink curtains. Same ceramic angel figurines on the dresser. Same framed scripture quote on the wall about honoring thy father and mother. It was almost midnight, but I packed my things anyway. Threw my weekend bag together, zipped it up, and booked a red-eye flight back to New York. I didn't wait until morning. I didn't leave a note. I didn't say goodbye. I ordered an Uber and waited for it in the driveway, watching my breath rise into the cold Georgia air like smoke off a dying fire. The driver was chatty. Said his name was Kyle, asked what brought me to town. I told him I was visiting family. He said, always good to see the folks, and I smiled because I didn't feel like explaining that some families aren't really folks, they're just people you used to be related to. On the flight, I didn't sleep. I stared out the window into the dark, not even seeing the clouds, just staring into space, letting the buzz in my ears drown out the rest of it. I kept hearing his voice. "You just don't fit the image." And suddenly, I was replaying every birthday they forgot, every moment I was sidelined, every time I'd come home and felt like a stranger crashing someone else's reunion. How they always introduce me as Rachel, she lives in the city doing journalism or writing or something like that. They never really knew what I did. Never cared to ask. Because it wasn't a job you could print on a church bulletin. That album, That thick, glossy scrapbook of curated lies was just the final nail in a coffin they'd been building since I was 14 and started wearing combat boots and quoting Maya Angelou instead of baking cookies for the church fair. I think they'd made peace with the idea that I was a phase that never ended, an inconvenience, not a daughter. And maybe that would have been the end of it. Maybe I would have just gone back to my apartment, brushed it off, and added it to the long list of small rejections that had accumulated like dust behind a locked door. But something about this time, something about the coldness of it, the absolute clarity in his words, flipped a switch in me. Because if I didn't fit the image, maybe it was time to build a new one. One that was all mine. One that wasn't afraid to shine without their permission. I didn't cry that night. I didn't rage or vent to friends or drown myself in wine. I got home, took off my coat, and sat in the middle of my living room floor with my award still boxed on the shelf, unopened since the ceremony. I hadn't sent them pictures. I hadn't even told them about it. Because I knew, somehow I always knew, they wouldn't care. Or worse, they'd pretend to. But now, sitting there in the half-dark, I started to smile. Not out of happiness. Out of clarity. Out of something sharper than bitterness. Something closer to revenge. Because the next time they looked at a picture, it wasn't going to be one they could ignore. There's something uniquely cruel about being in a room full of people who share your blood, your face, your last name, and still feeling like a stranger walking into someone else's dinner party, not quite unwelcome, not quite included. Just tolerated in that polite, distant way people nod to someone they vaguely recognize but can't place, like you're a former coworker whose name they forgot and whose presence makes them vaguely uncomfortable but not enough to do anything about it. That was my childhood in a nutshell, a series of forced smiles, edited memories, and well-rehearsed lines of passive acceptance that never quite reached affection, let alone love. When people talk about being the middle child, they often mean it in that sitcom kind of way, overlooked but quirky, ignored but funny, the one who gets into trouble for attention and then becomes the emotional glue that no one acknowledges until it's too late. But I wasn't that kind of middle child. I wasn't the class clown or the misunderstood rebel. I was simply the piece that didn't fit, the one whose edges refused to sand down, the one whose questions made everyone shift uncomfortably and whose presence seemed to disrupt the carefully constructed image my parents had of a God-fearing, successful, clean-cut family from the South. From an early age, I understood, without anyone ever saying it out loud, that there was a script we were all supposed to follow, a silent, unbreakable social contract written in casseroles and church directories, in pressed khakis and pastel dresses, in quiet obedience and louder denial. And I, from the very beginning, was the child who couldn't, or wouldn't, memorize her lines. When Amanda got baptized at 8, the entire congregation clapped and praised her for her spiritual maturity. When Evan preached his first sermon at 17, half the town came to see him speak. But when I won the statewide poetry contest in 6th grade and stood on stage reading a piece about loneliness and shadows, my mother pulled me aside afterward, smile brittle as old glass, and whispered, "Next time, maybe write something happier. People don't need that kind of heaviness on a Tuesday night." It didn't take long to realize that every time I did something worth noticing, they looked away. My 10th birthday party, the one I planned myself with handmade invitations and a list of kids from school I'd worked up the nerve to approach, turned into a complete disaster when no one showed up, not because of me, but because the invitations were mysteriously never mailed. My mom claimed it was an oversight, that she thought I'd already handled it, and when I cried in the bathroom for over an hour, she knocked once, sighed, and said through the door, "Rachel, you have to learn not to be so dramatic." By the time high school rolled around, I had stopped asking for help altogether. When I wanted to go to prom, I saved up from my after-school job at the bookstore and bought fabric to sew my own dress, a midnight blue thing with a halter neckline and small silver beads I stitched by hand. I remember standing at the top of the stairs, holding my breath, waiting for someone, anyone, to tell me I looked beautiful. Instead, my mom pursed her lips, gave me a once-over, and said, "It's a little too attention-seeking. Go change. I'll find something appropriate." She pulled out an old dress of Amanda's, beige and shapeless, and handed it to me like a punishment I somehow deserved. That night, I sat in the car outside the school gym and watched other girls walk in, laughing and spinning in gowns that shimmered under the parking lot lights, while I pretended I had a stomachache and asked my date to take me home. I didn't even cry. I just stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror and tried to imagine what it felt like to be wanted. College was the first time I tasted freedom, not the kind you toast with champagne or scream about from rooftops, but the slow, quiet kind that seeps into your bones when no one's watching you anymore. I majored in journalism because I had 1,000 questions and no one back home had ever let me ask them. I wanted to dig, to uncover, to speak for people like me, the invisible ones, the daughters who weren't in the pictures, the kids who stopped trying to be enough because they finally realized they weren't the problem. But even then, the ghost of that house followed me. Every holiday season, there was the same condescending invitation, sent late and signed, passed through Amanda or Evan like a cold hand-me-down, with an expectation that I'd drop everything and come back to pretend we were something we never were. And every time I did, I left feeling a little smaller, a little emptier, like I'd stepped into a funhouse mirror version of myself where my voice didn't matter and my choices were just unfortunate detours from the script. I remember the Thanksgiving 2 years before the album incident. I'd just published a piece that got picked up by a national outlet, an expose on financial abuse in mega churches that was getting some serious traction. I brought a printed copy home, hoping, even at 36, that maybe they'd read it and see me really see me. My dad glanced at the headline, chuckled, and said, "You've always been a little too interested in scandal. Maybe next time, write something uplifting." My mom nodded and asked if I'd thought about writing devotionals. Evan muttered something about how I was probably going to get sued. Amanda smiled that tight, passive smile she always did and said, "Well, at least you're still writing." That's nice. They weren't cruel, not in the way that leaves bruises or breaks bones. They were cruel in the way a draft sneaks under a door in winter and settles into your spine, quiet, constant, unrelenting. They were cruel in how they erased me without ever saying the words. How they'd perfected the art of pretending I didn't exist, and then told themselves they'd done everything they could. A few days after that Thanksgiving, I got a text from Amanda. It was short. "Don't bring up the photo thing again. It's not worth the drama." I stared at it for a long time, sitting on the edge of my bathtub in a towel, hair dripping, trying to figure out if it was more pathetic that they still thought I cared enough to argue, or that part of me actually did. But something had started shifting in me. A slow burn. A kind of resolve I hadn't felt before, not rage, not grief, but something sharper, steadier. Because if I wasn't worth a place in their photo albums, I was going to make damn sure I took up space somewhere else. Somewhere they couldn't ignore. Somewhere they couldn't crop me out. There is a peculiar silence that settles into your bones when you leave home, not just physically, not just packing your things into 2 suitcases and catching a bus to a city that's never heard your name before, but the kind of departure that cuts cords you thought were made of something eternal, something binding, like blood or history or those frail threads people call family ties, but which, when tugged too hard, snap with barely a sound. When I moved to New York at 25, it wasn't with some grand ambition or cinematic dream of making it big. It was with quiet exhaustion, the kind that builds up after years of being told you're too much and not enough all at once, of watching everyone around you fall into neat, acceptable categories while you became a question mark that no one wanted to answer. I rented a 4th-floor walk-up in Brooklyn, the kind of place that smelled vaguely of mold and heating oil and came with the kind of cracked windows that rattled in the wind. But to me, it was freedom, it was air, it was mine. I took every job I could find, barista at a vegan cafe where I got yelled at for using the wrong kind of oat milk, copywriting for a dental clinic that insisted on calling teeth smile accessories, even dog walking for a woman who dressed her bulldog in cashmere. I said yes to everything because saying no felt like a luxury people like me couldn't afford, not after everything I'd left behind, not after every holiday card that conveniently left out my name, not after every Sunday school lecture about the importance of family from people who barely looked me in the eye. But even in that chaos, even in the hunger and the rejection and the nights I cried into cheap takeout containers because I hadn't sold a single pitch all week, something inside me began to stretch, cautiously, quietly, like a body coming back to life after being frozen in place. I started writing again, not for grades or for approval, but because I had to, because the stories were clawing at my insides and threatening to rot if I didn't let them out. I wrote about things people in my hometown would have called shameful, distasteful, inappropriate. I wrote about loneliness in marriage, about the hypocrisy of purity culture, about the way women disappear in their own homes. I wrote like I was bleeding and building something at the same time. 3 years in, I finally sold a piece that changed everything. It was an investigative report on abuse within a national religious nonprofit, a story no one wanted to touch because the names involved were too powerful, too well-connected, too deeply rooted in communities that would rather protect the illusion of virtue than confront the rot beneath the surface. But I didn't back off. I found the victims, I listened to them, I believed them, and I told their stories with everything I had. When it published, it exploded, not in a glamorous, movie montage kind of way, but in a slow, terrifying burn. My inbox flooded. My editor called me crying. I got death threats. I got speaking requests. I got a call from a woman in Alabama who told me I'd saved her life. And when the award came, when I stood on that stage in a black dress I bought on clearance and held that heavy glass trophy in my hands, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt still. I felt like I was standing in the exact center of everything I'd ever been told I couldn't have. I wasn't just succeeding, I was surviving. And I wanted, just for a moment, to share that with the people who had watched me grow up, or at least pretended to. So I sent them the link. Just a link, no commentary, no demand for praise, no explanation. I sent it to the family group chat that I was occasionally included in when someone had a baby or needed prayers for a gallbladder surgery. I figured maybe, they'd read it, maybe they'd feel something, maybe they'd reach out. The response came 3 days later, not in a phone call, not even a full message, but in an email from my father. The subject line was "Nice job." The body of the email was a single line, "Congrats on your journalism thing. Hope you're staying safe." He spelled my name wrong. 2 letters swapped, not even autocorrect's fault, just carelessness. That was the entirety of his response to the most important work I'd ever done. Amanda didn't reply at all. Evan sent a thumbs-up emoji. My mother sent a Bible verse about humility and told me to remember who I was. I stared at the screen, not angry, not even disappointed, really more like numb, like I'd just touched something cold enough to burn. Because in that moment, I realized I could win a Pulitzer, and they'd still look at me like I'd wandered off script, like I was the one ruining the show by refusing to play the part they'd written for me years ago. So I did what any daughter with a wicked sense of irony would do. I agreed to a podcast interview. It was one of those new media shows with a sharp, feminist edge, a host who wasn't afraid to dig into the mess. Toward the end of the episode, she asked if my family had supported me during the investigation. I paused, not for drama, but because the answer came with such weight, I had to figure out how to lift it into words. I said, I don't really have a family worth mentioning. The silence that followed was the kind you could cut with a knife. But I didn't take it back. The clip went viral, not millions of views viral, but enough that people from high school started sending me screenshots, enough that distant cousins messaged me with awkward check-ins, enough that my mother called twice in one day and left voicemails that started calm and ended with brittle, wounded sighs. Amanda texted me a paragraph, one of those passive-aggressive monologues dressed up as concern, accusing me of trying to hurt them for attention. Evan, of all people, asked me if I was going through something and if I needed help. I didn't reply to any of them. But the one message that stuck with me came from my father, and it wasn't a message so much as a voicemail, a 30-second recording I must have replayed a dozen times, not because of what he said, but because of how carefully he said it. We always supported you, he said, voice calm, deliberate, like a man building his defense in real time. We just didn't make a big thing out of it. You were complicated. You still are. And there it was again, that word. Complicated. As if I were a broken appliance or an unmanageable investment. as if loving me required a special manual they never had time to read. But by then, I didn't need their manual anymore. I was already writing my own. And the next chapter wasn't going to include them as editors. There is a moment, just before you commit to something irreversible, when the world seems to hold its breath, a stretch of stillness, not quiet exactly, but dense and vibrating, as if the future is waiting on you to make a choice, to tip the first domino and accept whatever comes tumbling after it. For me, that moment came in late November, as I sat in my apartment, holding the annual family newsletter in one hand and a half-full glass of red wine in the other, staring at the now familiar collage of curated happiness, stock photo-level perfection, and glossy lies that somehow still managed to omit me without a single line of acknowledgement or apology. Not even a passing mention of where I lived, what I did, or the fact that I existed at all. The letter was signed, as always, with love, from all of us, the Hartsfields, as if all of us were some exclusive club I'd never been invited into, and the price of admission was to become someone I had never wanted to be. It wasn't rage that rose in my chest then. Rage had come and gone so many times over the years that it had worn itself into something duller, heavier, like sediment at the bottom of a glass. It was something colder, more focused, something that felt like strategy. It wasn't about proving myself anymore, because I knew I had already done that, not through their standards, not on their timeline, but in the way that mattered to me. I'd built something from nothing, brick by brick, rejection by rejection, in a city that didn't care about my last name or my reputation or whether I made the holiday card this year. I'd made a life I could actually stand to live, and I wasn't going to keep pretending that being ignored by people who never truly saw me was anything less than a kind of liberation. But I also wasn't done. Not yet. The idea came slowly, then all at once, like a match dropped into gasoline, dangerous, beautiful, impossible to put out. I would send a card of my own. Not a passive-aggressive email. Not a sarcastic text. A real card, the kind you could hold in your hands, display on a mantle, pass around at a dinner party. The kind they'd be forced to look at to actually see. The kind that wouldn't let them pretend anymore. I hired a photographer. A real one, not some influencer for hire who would slap a filter on it and call it a day, but a woman who specialized in portraits that felt cinematic and uncomfortably intimate. I told her what I wanted: elegance, defiance, clarity. We chose the rooftop of my building, with the city skyline stretched out behind me like a crown I'd finally earned. I wore a red velvet gown that hugged my body like it was made for vengeance, and I stood barefoot, one hand holding the journalism award that had cracked open my career, the other wrapped around a crystal flute of champagne, raised not in celebration, but in challenge. The photographer adjusted the light, tilted her head, and said, almost as a joke, "This looks like a woman who doesn't need anyone's approval." I didn't respond. I just held the pose. The caption was short. Just one line, in delicate gold script: "Merry Christmas from Rachel, the daughter who didn't fit the image." I had 100 copies printed, each on heavy matte cardstock with a deep crimson border. I addressed them by hand, no printed labels, no shortcuts. I sent them not just to my parents and siblings, but to every person who had ever received a Hartsfield newsletter and never thought to ask where I'd gone. Extended family. Old family friends. Church members. Neighbors. My third-grade teacher. My mom's bridge group. I even sent one to the church office, addressed to the pastor, knowing full well that it would be passed around at the next staff meeting like a scandal too delicious to ignore. The fallout didn't take long to start. It began with a group text from Amanda, a collection of clipped sentences that barely contained the outrage beneath their polite phrasing. "Rachel, what exactly are you trying to accomplish? This is really uncalled for. You're embarrassing the whole family." I didn't respond. A few hours later, Evan chimed in, "Wow. Real mature. You've got problems, seriously." Still, I stayed silent. I'd already said everything I needed to, not in words, but in presence, in the fact that they could no longer pretend I wasn't there. Then came the phone calls. My mother left a message first, her voice brittle, stretched too thin, like someone trying to hold together a house of cards in a hurricane. She didn't ask why I'd done it. She just asked me to stop. "This isn't who you are, Rachel," she said, her voice cracking in the middle. "You don't have to make a scene to be seen." That line hit me harder than I expected, not because I believed it, but because she really did. She genuinely thought that my need to be visible was a flaw, that being seen for who I was fully, unapologetically, was somehow shameful, embarrassing, dangerous. But the worst part wasn't their anger. It was their confusion. They didn't understand why I'd done it. They couldn't fathom that years of being erased might turn a woman into someone who no longer asked for permission. They thought I was acting out. They didn't realize I was finally acting into my own power, my own truth, my own damn story. And then something I didn't expect happened. My cousin Danielle, who I hadn't spoken to in a decade, messaged me privately. "I just got your card." I cried. "I always thought you were the lucky one for getting out, but I never realized how hard it was for you. Thank you for doing what I couldn't." Then came another message from an old family friend. "Your card is going around the prayer circle. Half of them are furious. The other half are secretly cheering you on. Just thought you'd like to know." The night after the cards went out, I poured myself a glass of whiskey and stood on the same rooftop where the photo had been taken, letting the December wind cut across my skin like a truth too long buried. I didn't feel triumphant, not exactly. What I felt was something more dangerous. I felt seen. And once you've tasted that, really tasted it, you can't go back to pretending invisibility is safety. I checked my phone one last time before bed. 17 missed calls from my mother. 12 from Amanda. 3 from numbers I didn't recognize. But the one that stood out was from Evan, not because he'd tried to call, but because the text that followed was just 2 words, heavy and strange and completely out of character. "We need to talk." And that was when I knew the card had done more than make a statement. It had cracked something open. Something deeper. Something they weren't ready for. Something none of us could ignore anymore. The strange thing about silence, especially the kind that comes after a storm you've started on purpose, is how quickly it begins to feel like both a punishment and a victory, like standing on the edge of a scorched field and realizing that yes, everything behind you is gone, reduced to ash and memory, but at the same time, for the first time in your life, the path ahead is completely clear. In the days that followed the Christmas card, that single photograph turned missile, that image too loud and too sharp to ignore, my phone transformed into something I both couldn't stop looking at and desperately wanted to throw out the window. The messages, voicemails, and passive-aggressive social media posts came in waves, like tides pulled by different moons of rage, confusion, pity, and something close to fear. But it was the text from Evan, the one that simply read, "We need to talk," that settled in my chest like a stone too heavy to swallow and too familiar to ignore. It took me 3 days to respond, not because I was avoiding him, not really, but because I wasn't sure I was ready to face whatever truth might come from a conversation with the one sibling who had always hovered on the edge, not quite cruel, not quite kind, not entirely absent, but never fully present either. Evan had always been the enigma, the youngest golden child whose ambition was cloaked in scripture, whose coldness came gift-wrapped in charm. He was the one who knew how to say all the right things in public and all the wrong things in private. But still, when he asked to meet in person, I said yes. Some part of me, the same part that still looked for my name in family newsletters, that still remembered the smell of Sunday roast and the way my mother used to hum when she was sewing, hoped there was something real buried under all those years of silence. We met at a coffee shop in Midtown, neutral territory with overpriced scones and too much ambient jazz, where the baristas looked like grad students and the tables were too small to hide behind. He arrived 10 minutes late, wearing a camel coat and a look that mixed exhaustion with polished concern, and for a moment, I almost laughed at how on-brand it all was. He ordered a black coffee, no sugar, and sat down across from me like a man preparing to deliver bad news gently, the way you might tell someone their dog had been hit but was still breathing. "I didn't come here to fight," he began, and I believed him, if only because his voice didn't carry the usual performance edge. He looked older than I remembered, not in a bad way, just more worn, like someone who'd finally started noticing the cost of all that pretending. I nodded and said nothing, letting the silence stretch long enough to make him uncomfortable. He cleared his throat. You blindsided them, you know. The card. The caption. Everything. They've been blindsiding me since I was 12, I said, not bitter, just tired. I thought it was time for a little symmetry. He didn't argue. He looked down at his hands, then up at me again, and what came next was not what I expected. There's something you don't know, he said, voice quieter now, as if lowering the volume might make it hurt less. I wasn't supposed to tell you. Ever. But after all this, I don't know. Maybe you deserve to know. What followed wasn't some grand revelation or melodramatic confession. It wasn't about hidden abuse or secret affairs. Not exactly, but it was the kind of truth that reshapes every memory you've ever held too tightly. He told me that when I was born, there had been a complication, as he put it, though he never clarified what kind. Something about timing, about suspicion, about a period of whispered arguments and sudden cold silences that lasted for years. My father had always claimed I was his, but according to Evan, there had been enough doubt, enough rumors, enough inconsistencies, that the suspicion never fully died, only festered beneath the surface. They never got a paternity test, he said, stirring his coffee even though he hadn't added anything to it. But they never really forgave each other after you. Mom wouldn't talk about it. Dad, well, you know Dad. He buried it under image. I sat back in my chair, my entire body both humming and numb, because even though part of me had always suspected something, always wondered why I was treated like a guest in my own house, hearing it said aloud still cracked something deep. Suddenly, every omission, every edited photograph, every missed birthday and backhanded compliment and tight-lipped dinner made a cruel kind of sense. I hadn't been excluded just because I was different. I'd been excluded because I was inconvenient proof of something they were too afraid to confront, a living question mark in a family that only allowed exclamation points of certainty. He leaned in then, voice softer, more human. I don't know if it's true, Rachel. I really don't. But it messed them up. And I think, somewhere along the way, they started punishing you for that, for existing in a story they didn't want told. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel angry. What I felt was hollow, like a house finally admitting it had termites in the foundation all along. I thanked him, not out of warmth, but because I didn't know what else to do, and we parted ways without hugging, without promises to talk soon. There was nothing else to say. Some siblings are just ghosts you meet in coffee shops. That night, I went home and wrote a letter long, unfiltered, filled with every memory I had locked in drawers for decades. I wrote about being 10 and alone on my birthday. I wrote about the dress they made me change out of for prom. I wrote about the way my father looked through me like I was a smudge on glass, about the way my mother flinched whenever I told the truth. I wrote about the card, what it meant, why I sent it, what I wanted them to see. And then I folded the pages neatly, sealed them in an envelope, addressed it to Mom and Dad, and placed it on the windowsill, where it sat untouched for weeks until I finally threw it into a drawer and forgot about it. Some letters aren't meant to be sent. Some truths are only meant to be written. In the months that followed, the family circle spun on without me. Amanda posted a photo of a new golden retriever puppy. Evan led a retreat for married couples. My mother posted a filtered photo of her hydrangeas and captioned it with a verse about grace. But none of them called. None of them mentioned the card again. It was as if the only way they could survive my truth was to pretend it had never been spoken. But I didn't mind. Not anymore. Because I had my own frame now, not the kind they hang in dining rooms or feature in newsletters, but something stronger. The Christmas card hung in my entryway, framed in dark oak, next to the award that had once sat unopened in its box. It wasn't about gloating or revenge anymore. It was about remembering that I didn't need to fit into their image to be whole. And sometimes, when I pass by it, keys in hand, ready to face whatever comes next, I whisper to no one in particular, they never took me out of the album. I just stopped asking to be in it. That, I think, is the only ending I'll ever need. Or maybe it's just the beginning.